At breakfast, my 4-year-old son asked my wife, "Mommy, when is that funny uncle coming back?" He gave me a toy car. I didn't say a word. I just started counting. The visits, the transfers, the lies. By the time she figured out I knew, it was already too late for her to run. My name is Clayton Merritt. I'm 48 years old, and I've been working this land since I was 19. 700 acres of soybeans and corn outside of Millhaven, Indiana. My grandfather started it. My father kept it going, and I poured the best years of my life into making it something worth passing down. I built the farmhouse addition with my own hands, dug the irrigation trenches myself, drove the tractor through ice storms because the fields don't care about your feelings. I married Bridget 6 years ago. She was from town, a bookkeeper at a local firm, sharp and pretty and full of energy that I thought would balance out my quieter nature. She knew what she was getting into. A farmer's wife isn't a glamorous life. Early mornings, muddy boots at the door, seasons that dictate everything. For a while, she seemed fine with it. More than fine. Then somewhere around year 4, something in her started pulling in a different direction, and I was too busy watching the weather to notice. I should have noticed when she started driving into town more. 3, 4 times a week, said it was errands, said it was a yoga class she'd signed up for. I never questioned it. That was my first mistake. Not the last, but the first. That Tuesday morning in April started like any other. I'd been up since 5, checking moisture levels in the south field after a heavy rain. Cooper, our 4-year-old, was already at the kitchen table when I came in, still in his pajamas, pushing a toy truck back and forth across the wood grain. Bridget stood at the counter scrolling her phone, barely looking up when I walked in. I poured coffee and sat across from my son. He had my eyes, gray and serious, but his mother's energy, always moving, always reaching for something. "Daddy, watch this," Cooper said, and launched the truck off the edge of the table. I caught it before it hit the floor. He laughed like that was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. Then he looked up at Bridget with that wide-open honesty that only 4-year-olds have. "Mommy," he said, "when is that funny uncle coming back?" He gave me a toy car and I want to play with him again. The kitchen went quiet. Not gradually. Instantly, like someone had cut the sound feed. Bridget's phone stopped moving in her hand. Her shoulders went rigid under her sweater. She didn't turn around right away. And when she did, her face had that careful, rehearsed stillness that I'd later learned to recognize as damage control. "What uncle, baby?" Her voice came out lighter than it should have. "The one who laughs loud," Cooper said, perfectly innocent, already reaching for his cereal. "He has a red truck. He'll let me sit in it." I watched Bridget's jaw tighten. She looked at me. Just a flash, less than a second. Then back at her son. "That's just a friend of Mommy's from work, sweetheart," she said. "He won't be coming by anymore." Something cold moved through my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter and more dangerous. The feeling of a man who realizes he's been the last to know something important. I didn't say anything. Didn't ask. I just sat there with my coffee going cold and watched my wife pretend that nothing had just happened. She was good at it. Practiced. After Cooper finished breakfast, she took him upstairs to get dressed, and I stayed at the table. The toy truck was still sitting near my elbow. Small, red, metal wheels. Not something we bought him. I turned it over in my hands. No brand mark on the bottom. Just a small, red truck that my 4-year-old son had been given by a man who'd been inside my house, sitting in the kitchen I'd built, laughing loud enough for a child to remember it. That was the moment I stopped being the kind of man who didn't go looking. I didn't confront Bridget that day, or the next. A man who spent his life reading weather knows one thing. You don't act on the first cloud. You watch the sky. You wait for the pattern to show itself. Then you move. What I did do was start paying attention. Really paying attention. The kind I should have been doing for months. Bridget had always been social. Always had reasons to be away from the farm. I'd accepted that. Farming is isolating by nature, and I never wanted her to feel trapped out here in the mud and quiet. So I gave her room. Plenty of it. Turns out I'd given her enough room to build a whole separate life. The week after Cooper's question, I started keeping a mental log. Tuesday afternoon, she said she had a client meeting in Millhaven. Came back 2 hours later than she'd said, smelling like a restaurant, not an office. Thursday evening, yoga class, she said, same as always. I checked the mat in the trunk of her car when she came home. Perfectly dry. Not a drop of sweat on it. Not a wrinkle from being unrolled. She'd been carrying that mat around for months like a prop. I said nothing, just noted it. What I didn't expect was a phone call on Friday morning. Dr. Anita Rhodes, Cooper's pediatrician, called me at 7:15 while I was out checking the East Field. I almost let go to voicemail, but something made me answer. "Mr. Merritt," she said, and her voice had that careful, measured tone that doctors use when they're about to say something they're required to say, but don't enjoy saying. "I want to follow up on Cooper's visit yesterday." I stopped walking. "Bridget took him in." She did. "Routine checkup. Everything's fine physically." A pause. "But during the visit, Cooper mentioned something that I'm obligated to document. He told me there was a man who visited your home. He called him a funny uncle, and that this person had been there more than once. Cooper seemed comfortable talking about it, which suggests repeated contact." Another pause. "I've noted it in his chart. I'm not making any assumptions, Mr. Merritt, but I want you to be aware that this conversation happened and that I documented it." I stood in the East Field with frost still on the ground, and my jaw set, so tight my back teeth ached. "Thank you, doctor," I said. "I appreciate you calling me directly." After I hung up, I stood there for a long moment. A pediatrician had now put it in writing. A 4-year-old had told his doctor about a man who came to our house when I wasn't there. Whatever Bridget thought she was managing, she'd lost control of it. That afternoon, I called my brother Neil. He drove out from Lafayette that same evening, pulled his truck up to the barn the way he always does, got out without any ceremony. Neil is 4 years younger than me and about 4 times louder, but when it counts, he's the steadiest man I know. We sat on the tailgate, and I laid it out for him. Cooper's question at breakfast, the dry yoga mat, the late returns, the pediatrician's call. Neil listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "How long you think it's been going on?" he finally asked. "Don't know. Long enough for her to get sloppy." "You need a name," Neil said. "You need to know who he is before you do anything else." He was right. A red truck. A loud laugh. A man who gave my son a toy car, like he was trying to win him over. That wasn't a casual friendship. That was a man making himself comfortable in a place he had no right to be. Neil suggested Russell Donovan, a former state investigator who'd gone private 6 years back. Said a colleague at his firm had used him in a custody case. Thorough, discreet, no drama. I called Russell the next morning. He answered on the second ring, asked 3 questions, and told me he could start within the week. What I didn't know yet was how far ahead Bridget already was. 2 days later, my neighbor Otis Graves came over at dusk. Otis is a 71, widower, been farming the land adjacent to mine for 40 years. He doesn't talk much, and he doesn't visit without a reason. He came to the porch, turned his cap in his hands once, and looked at me straight. "Clayton," he said, "I've been seeing a silver Ford F-250 parked down your back road a few times a week. Sits there an hour, sometimes 2, then leaves before you be getting back. Been going on since January. January. For months. You get a plate?" I asked. Otis reached into his shirt pocket and handed me a folded piece of paper. "Neat handwriting. Full plate number." "Didn't know if I should say something," he said. "Didn't feel right to stay quiet any longer." I looked at that plate number for a moment, then folded the paper and put it in my pocket. "You did right, Otis," I told him. "You did exactly right." He nodded once, put his cap back on, and walked back across the field without another word. That's the thing about good neighbors. They don't make a production of it. They just show up when it matters. I went inside, put the paper on the kitchen table next to the red toy truck, and sat there in the quiet of my own house. For months, that silver truck had been parking down my back road since January while I was out working the land that was supposed to give my son a future. I picked up my phone and texted Russell Donovan the plate number. Then I started making a list of everything I needed to know. Russell Donovan ran the plate in 48 hours. William Holloway, 38 years old, regional sales manager for an agricultural equipment company based out of Indianapolis. Drove a silver Ford F-250. Married. Wife's name Tara. 2 kids of his own. He covered a territory that included Millhaven, which meant he had a legitimate professional reason to be in the area. A legitimate professional reason that Bridget had apparently turned into something else entirely. Russell sent me a photo, along with the report. Holloway was broad-shouldered, easy smile, the kind of man who looked comfortable everywhere he went. I stared at that photo for about 30 seconds, then put my phone face down on the workbench and went back to fixing the tractor's hydraulic line. Some men fall apart at that moment. I've seen it happen to neighbors, to cousins, to guys I went to high school with. I understand it. But falling apart doesn't protect your land, and it doesn't protect your son. So I kept my hands busy and let my mind work. Russell had more. Over the following 10 days, he documented 5 separate visits. Holloway's truck coming down the back road while my truck was gone, staying between 90 minutes and 2 hours, leaving well before I'd be returning from the fields. Otis had been right about the pattern. Russell photographed it. He also found something I hadn't expected. Holloway had been posting on Instagram. Nothing explicit. He was smarter than that. But there were photos. A farmhouse porch with a rocking chair I recognized. A mug of coffee on a windowsill with the east field visible through the glass behind it. One photo captioned, "Where I feel most at home," with a sunset that could only have been taken from my property. My property. My porch. My field. Russell pulled the post before I could say anything about it. Screenshots first, then flagged for preservation. He'd done this before. I forwarded everything to Grant Fuller, my attorney, on a Thursday afternoon. Grant called me back within the hour. "This is solid," Grant told me. "Documented visits, timestamps, photographic evidence placing him on your property. Combined with the pediatrician's chart notation, you're in a strong position." He paused. "Has she done anything with the property or finances that you've noticed?" I hadn't looked. I started looking that same evening. It took me 2 hours going through our joint accounts and the farm's business records before I found it. Bridget had set up a sole proprietorship 6 months ago, a bookkeeping consulting LLC, registered to our home address. On its own, that wasn't alarming. She had the background for it. But when I pulled the business credit card statements, I saw charges that had nothing to do with any consulting work. Restaurant bills, hotel stays in Indianapolis, a weekend charge at a lodge near Bloomington, all run through the business account, all technically tied to our shared assets. I sat at the kitchen table with those printouts spread in front of me until the clock on the wall read midnight. The next morning, I drove into Millhaven and met with Dorothy Payne. Grant had referred her, forensic accountant, 68 years old, worked financial fraud cases for 30 years before going independent. She wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and brought a legal pad the size of a small door. She looked at what I'd found, asked me 12 questions in rapid succession, and then leaned back in her chair. "There's more here than personal spending," Dorothy said evenly. "This LLC has access to your farm's operating account as a linked account. If someone wanted to move money before a divorce filing, this structure would make it very easy to do." The word divorce sat on the table between us like a stone. "Can you trace where everything went?" I asked. "I can trace everything," she replied. "Give me 2 weeks." I drove home with the windows down, cold April air sharp on my face, and stopped at Otis's fence line on the way up the drive. He was already outside, like he'd been expecting me. I told him what I'd found. Not all of it, just enough. Otis listened, nodded once, and reached into his jacket pocket. He handed me a small notebook, spiral-bound, the kind you buy at a gas station. Inside, in his careful handwriting, were dates and times going back to January. Every visit he'd logged, every plate number, timestamps, weather conditions, notes on how long the truck stayed. 3 months of documentation. A 71-year-old man had been keeping records for 3 months because he knew something was wrong and he didn't know how else to help. My throat tightened in a way I hadn't expected. "Otis," I said, "you didn't have to do this." He looked at me with those steady gray eyes. "Cooper's going to need his father to win this," he said simply. Figured I'd do my part. I took the notebook home and added it to the folder that was getting thicker by the day. Evidence, documentation, financial records, photographs. Bridget was building a way out. I was building a wall she couldn't get through. Dorothy Payne called me on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after our first meeting. "Mr. Merritt," she said, and I could hear papers moving on her end, "I need you to come in. Today, if possible." I was there by 10. She had the conference table covered, printouts, highlighted statements, a timeline she'd drawn on a legal pad in red marker. She walked me through it methodically, the way a surgeon explains a procedure. Calm, precise, no wasted words. The LLC Bridget had set up wasn't just running personal expenses. Over 7 months, she transferred a total of $31,000 from the farm's operating account into the business account, then moved it again from there into a third account I hadn't known existed, a personal savings account in her name only, opened at a bank in Indianapolis. $31,000. Quietly. Methodically. 7 months. She didn't take it all at once. Dorothy explained, tapping the timeline. Small transfers, irregular amounts. Nothing that would trigger an automatic alert. Whoever advised her on this knew what they were doing. I thought about Holloway, regional sales manager, a man who understood business accounts and cash flow, a man who'd had months of access to my home and, apparently, my wife's financial planning. Is any of this recoverable? I asked. All of it, Dorothy said firmly. The transfers are documented. The account exists. The money didn't disappear. It just moved. With the right legal action, we freeze that account before anything else moves out of it. I called Grant Fuller from the parking lot. He filed for an emergency asset freeze before the end of the business day. Bridget didn't know yet. That was important. What happened next? I hadn't planned for. That Friday, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice, steady, but with something careful underneath it. Mr. Merritt, my name is Tara Holloway. I'm William Holloway's wife. A brief pause. I think we need to talk. We met the following morning at a diner in the next town over. Tara was 36, sharp-eyed, and clearly hadn't slept well in weeks. She had a manila envelope on the table in front of her that she pushed toward me before we'd even ordered coffee. I found out 4 months ago, she said quietly. I've been documenting since then. Phone records, bank withdrawals, a hotel receipt I found in his jacket. She nodded at the envelope. That's copies of all of it. I looked at what she'd brought. Dates that matched Russell's surveillance logs. Text messages she'd photographed off his phone. A receipt from the Bloomington Lodge, same weekend, I'd found on Bridget's business card statement. 2 families. One lie running through both of them. What do you want out of this? I asked her directly. Tara looked at me without flinching. I want him to answer for it in court with no room to maneuver. And I think that's easier if we're both standing there with the same evidence. She was right. 2 corroborating witnesses, 2 sets of independently gathered documentation, 2 clean chains of evidence pointing at the same pattern of behavior. I extended my hand across the table. Then let's make sure neither of them has anywhere left to go, I said. She shook it without hesitation. On the drive home, I passed the entrance to my back road and slowed without meaning to. No silver truck parked in the shadows today. But I knew now, really knew, that this had been going on since January, that $31,000 of my farm's money was sitting in a bank account in Indianapolis, and that my wife had been planning her exit while I was out in the fields at 5 in the morning, working to build something worth leaving to my son. I pulled into the farm, cut the engine, and sat for a moment. Then I got out, walked to the barn, and got back to work. Because that's what you do when you're a farmer. The land doesn't stop needing you just because your world tilted sideways. And Cooper was going to need a father who kept his feet under him. I was going to keep my feet under me. Neil drove out again on a Saturday, this time with purpose. He sat at my kitchen table and went through everything I had. Russell's surveillance package, Dorothy's financial timeline, Tara Holloway's folder, Otis's notebook. He read it all slowly, the way he reads contracts at his firm, nothing rushed, nothing skimmed. When he finished, he stacked the papers neatly and looked up at me. Clayton, he said, she's not just cheating on you. She's been dismantling this farm from the inside. I already knew it. Hearing it said out loud by my brother was a different thing entirely. Neil had been doing some digging of his own since my first call to him. He talked to people in town, quietly, carefully, the way you do when you don't want to tip your hand. What he'd found made the back of my neck burn. 3 of Bridget's closest friends had known about William Holloway. Not suspected, known. Jenna Marsh, who ran the flower shop downtown. Paula Hendricks, who Bridget had lunch with every other week for 2 years. And Kevin Sloan, the husband of Bridget's college roommate, who'd apparently seen Holloway and Bridget together at a restaurant in Indianapolis 6 months ago and said nothing to anyone except his wife, who said nothing to me. 3 people, inside our social circle, carrying a secret that belonged to me and to Cooper, and choosing to protect her instead. I thought about every conversation I'd had with Jenna at the farmer's market, every time I'd waved at Paula across a parking lot, every holiday gathering where Kevin Sloan had shaken my hand and looked me in the eye. I called each of them, one at a time. No anger in my voice, just clarity. I know you knew, I said to each of them. I'm not calling to argue about it. I'm calling because I want you to know that I know, and that it won't be forgotten. Jenna stammered. Paula cried. Kevin tried to explain himself for about 90 seconds before I thanked him for his time and hung up. Then I sat on the porch and let the anger burn off in the cold air. Bridget came home that evening from wherever she'd been and found me at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the kind of silence that has weight to it. She stood in the doorway for a moment, reading the room the way she always did, and I watched something uncertain move across her face. "Hard day?" she asked, casual, hanging her keys on the hook. "Educational," I said. She looked at me for a half-second longer than she should have, then went to check on Cooper upstairs. I listened to her footsteps on the ceiling above me and thought about $31,000 and a man with a loud laugh who'd sat in my kitchen and given my son a toy car. The next morning, Otis knocked on my barn door just after 7. He wasn't alone. Standing behind him was a woman I didn't recognize, mid-40s, business clothes, carrying a leather briefcase. Otis introduced her as Janet Pruitt, a reporter from the regional agricultural news outlet. But she wasn't there for a story. She was there because she was Otis's niece and because she'd spent 15 years before journalism working in real estate law. "Uncle Otis told me what's happening," she said directly, no preamble. "I want to help. Not professionally, personally. I've seen this exact financial structure used before. An LLC linked to a farm operating account. Small transfers over time. I can help you document the legal exposure and language your attorney can use immediately." I looked at Otis. He just shrugged with that quiet dignity of his. "Figured you needed someone who speaks the right language," he said. Janet spent 3 hours at my kitchen table with Dorothy Payne's reports and a fresh legal pad. By the time she left, she drafted a 6-page memo outlining the exact statutes under which Bridget's financial maneuvers constituted civil fraud. Grant Fuller called it the cleanest layup he'd ever been handed. What I didn't know yet was that Bridget was already moving. Russell called me that afternoon. He'd been running background on Holloway as a matter of course, and he'd found something new. Holloway had been to a real estate attorney's office in Indianapolis twice in the past 3 weeks. The attorney specialized in property transfers. I called Grant before Russell had even finished talking. Grant filed a formal lease pendens on the farm property by the end of business that day. A legal notice that the property was under dispute and could not be transferred or encumbered without court approval. Bridget had been 2 steps from the door. Now the door had a lock on it she couldn't open. That evening, I stood at the fence line watching the last light fade over the south field. 700 acres. My grandfather's hands had first turned this soil. My father's had kept it going through droughts and downturns. Mine had expanded it, modernized it, prepared it for Cooper to inherit someday. Nobody was taking it. Not Bridget. Not Holloway. Nobody. I went inside, checked on my son asleep in his dinosaur print pajamas, and sat on the edge of his bed for a minute in the dark. "We're going to be fine, Bud," I said quietly. He didn't wake up, but I meant it more than I'd meant most things in my life. The legal separation filing landed on a Tuesday morning. Grant called me before Bridget had even left the house. Her attorney, Lorraine Kane, 45 years old, sharp as a blade and twice as cold, had filed a 30-page motion that accused me of financial control, emotional manipulation, and what she called systematic isolation of a vulnerable spouse. She was asking for the farmhouse, primary custody of Cooper, and spousal support. I read the summary Grant emailed me, standing in the barn, mud on my boots, morning chores half done. I finished the chores before I called him back. "She's going for everything," Grant said when I answered. "She won't get it," I replied. "What does she actually have? Right now?" Her word and a sympathetic narrative. Kane is good at building those. He paused. "But Clayton, there's more." Lorraine Kane filed a judicial assignment preference this morning. She specifically requested Judge Patricia Holt. I didn't know the name. Grant explained. Judge Patricia Holt had given 2 widely circulated interviews over the past 3 years, in which she'd spoken about what she called the financial power imbalance inherent in agricultural marriages where one spouse controls land assets. She'd been quoted saying that courts historically undervalued the non-farming spouse's contribution to household stability. "She's angling for a sympathetic bench," Grant said. "Kane does this routinely. She researches judges, finds the ones most likely to view her client favorably, and requests them by name. Can we challenge it? We can file a motion for judicial recusal based on demonstrated bias. It's not guaranteed, but those interviews give us grounds." He thought for a moment. It'll cost us time. 2, maybe 3 weeks while the motion is heard. File it. I said immediately. I'd rather lose 3 weeks than lose the farm to a biased bench. Grant filed the recusal motion that afternoon. 2 days later, Judge Holt voluntarily recused herself without waiting for a ruling. Apparently, her clerk had flagged the interviews the same morning. It was a quiet victory, but it mattered. It told me that Lorraine Kane's playbook had a page Grant already knew how to counter. What came next, though, was less expected. I was in the equipment shed on a Thursday afternoon when Russell called. "You need to see something," he said. "Check your email." It was a screenshot, forwarded through a chain that Russell had traced back to an anonymous source, someone inside Holloway's company. It showed an email thread between Holloway and Bridget from 4 months ago. In it, Holloway wrote, "Once the property transfer goes through, we can list it within 60 days. Market's strong right now." Bridget's reply, "Clayton won't fight it. He never fights anything." I read that twice. Then I forwarded it to Grant, called Russell back, and asked him to find out everything he could about whoever had sent it. Russell called back within the hour. The source was a woman named Diane Kraft, Holloway's administrative assistant, who'd been quietly building a file on him for months after discovering he'd been expensing personal trips on the company account. She wasn't doing it for me. She was doing it because she was tired of covering for him. But her timing had just handed me something significant. Meanwhile, Bridget came home that evening and tried a different approach entirely. She was calm, measured. She sat across the kitchen table from me and spoke in the tone of someone who'd been coached, even reasonable, designed to sound like the wrong party. "Clayton, I don't want this to get ugly," she began. "I made mistakes. I know that. But this farm, this house, these are my home too. Cooper's home. If we fight each other through lawyers, the only people who lose are us and our son." I let her finish. Then I looked at her across the table and said, "You transferred $31,000 out of this farm's operating account over 7 months. You set up a business structure specifically designed to make that money invisible. You had a real estate attorney looking at transfer options for property I've worked my entire adult life to protect." I kept my voice quiet and even. "You want to talk about not making this ugly? That ship sailed a long time ago, Bridget. You were at the wheel." Her composure slipped. Just for a moment, a flash of something behind her eyes that wasn't grief. It was calculation. She'd been hoping I didn't know all of it yet. Now she knew that I did. She left the kitchen without another word. I poured my coffee down the drain, rinsed the cup, and went to check on Cooper. He was in the living room building a tower out of wooden blocks, completely absorbed, narrating quietly to himself the way 4-year-olds do. I sat on the floor next to him and handed him blocks without being asked. He didn't look up, just kept building. "Good one, Daddy," he said when I handed him a particularly flat piece that fit perfectly. That was enough to keep me steady for another day. Grant scheduled the deposition for a Thursday morning at his office in Millhaven. Bridget arrived with Lorraine Kane 20 minutes late, a small power move that Grant had anticipated. He didn't acknowledge it, just gestured to the chairs across the table and opened his folder. The room was plain and bright. Conference table, 6 chairs, a window overlooking the parking lot. I sat at one end with Grant beside me. Dorothy Payne was there at Grant's request, her reading glasses on, a copy of her financial report in front of her. Russell Donovan sat quietly near the door, present as a documented witness. Neil had driven down from Lafayette and sat in the waiting room, close enough if I needed him, out of the way if I didn't. Lorraine Kane opened with what Grant later called the Standard Kane Overture, a rehearsed statement about Bridget's emotional suffering, her sense of isolation on the farm, her diminished professional identity during the marriage. It was polished and designed to humanize her client before a single piece of evidence was introduced. I let her finish. Then I looked at Bridget directly for the first time since she'd walked in. She was composed, dressed conservatively, minimal jewelry, the picture of a woman wronged. But she wouldn't hold my gaze for more than a second at a time. Grant started with the financial documentation. Dorothy walked through the LLC structure, the linked operating account, the transfer timeline, $31,000, 7 months, 18 separate transactions. She laid the statements on the table one at a time, each one highlighted, each one dated. Lorraine Kane objected twice. Grant overruled her both times with case citations he'd clearly prepared for exactly those objections. Then Grant introduced the deposition question that changed the temperature in the room entirely. "Mrs. Merritt," he said, "were you and your husband operating under any form of agreed arrangement that permitted outside romantic relationships?" Lorraine Kane's hand went up immediately. "Objection. Relevance. It's directly relevant to the claim of emotional neglect," Grant replied evenly. "If Mrs. Merritt is alleging that her husband failed to meet her emotional needs, the nature of the marital arrangement is material." The objection was overruled. Bridget looked at Kane, who gave her a barely perceptible nod. "We had an understanding," Bridget said carefully. "An unspoken one." I kept my face still. Grant made a small note. "An unspoken understanding," Grant repeated. "Mrs. Merritt, I'd like to show you Exhibit 14. He slid a printed email across the table. Bridget's message to Holloway from 8 months ago, recovered by Russell from a device backup. The one where she'd written, "He has no idea, and he won't. He trusts too easily. Always has." Bridget's composure didn't shatter, but it bent, visibly, like a board under too much weight. "That doesn't represent," she started. "It was sent from your personal email address at 11:14 on a Tuesday evening," Grant said. "Is that your email address, Mrs. Merritt?" A long pause. "Yes." "Then the record will reflect that the alleged unspoken understanding was not, in fact, understood by Mr. Merritt." Lorraine Kane called for a recess. They stepped out for 12 minutes. When they came back, something in Bridget's posture had shifted. The careful performance had a fracture running through it now, the kind you can't seal back up. Grant introduced the property documentation next. The real estate attorney's office visits. The lease pendants filing. The transfer structure Dorothy had identified. Kane tried to reframe each piece. Grant dismantled each reframe methodically, without heat, without theater. He'd been doing this for 26 years, and it showed. By the time they left, Lorraine Kane was no longer leading with the wronged wife narrative. She was managing damage. In the parking lot afterward, Grant put a hand on my shoulder. "She came in thinking she had leverage," he said. "She doesn't. Not anymore." Neil was waiting by my truck. He'd seen their faces as they walked out. "How bad was it?" he asked. "Bad enough," I said. "For her." We drove back to the farm in separate trucks. I stopped at the top of the long driveway and looked down at the land spread out below, fields greening up now that spring had dug in, the barn roof catching the afternoon light, the house where Cooper was with his babysitter, probably running trucks across the kitchen floor. 700 acres. 3 generations of work. Nobody was getting this. Not today. Not ever. The final hearing was set for a Monday. Grant called it a settlement conference, but we both knew what it really was. The moment when Bridget and her attorney would either accept the terms or watch Dorothy Payne walk a judge through $31,000 in fraudulent transfers line by line. They accepted the terms. The morning of the conference, I wore my good shirt, the one I saved for church and funerals, and drove into Millhaven with Neil riding shotgun. We didn't talk much. Didn't need to. Bridget and Lorraine Kane were already seated when we arrived. Tara Holloway's documentation had been submitted as corroborating evidence the prior week. Her attorney had coordinated with Grant, and the hotel receipts, phone records, and credit card statements had been formally entered in the record. Holloway himself was facing a parallel proceeding in Indianapolis, and from what Tara's attorney had communicated, he was in no position to be anyone's ally. Dorothy laid out the financial summary first. $31,000 transferred. Emergency freeze had preserved it. The personal savings account in Indianapolis held $28,000 of it. 2 transactions had already cleared before the freeze hit, totaling $3,000 that had gone to a restaurant billing account linked to Holloway's personal credit card. Grant placed the settlement terms on the table. Full legal and physical custody of Cooper to me, with Bridget receiving structured supervised visitation until she completed a court-approved family counseling program. The farm, land, equipment, structures, and operating accounts remained entirely in my name, with no claim. The $31,000 returned in full, drawn from the frozen account, with the remainder covered by the liquidation of Bridget's personal vehicle and a structured repayment plan on the balance. No spousal support. The farmhouse was mine. Lorraine Kane went through the motions of pushing back. She tried 3 angles in 20 minutes. Grant had documented responses to all 3. After the second recess, Kane leaned over Bridget and spoke quietly for about 90 seconds. Bridget stared at the table. Then she picked up the pen. She signed without looking at me. The room cleared out quickly after that. Kane left first, efficient and expressionless. Bridget gathered her things slowly, like a woman moving through water. At the door, she stopped, turned back, looked at me, really looked at me, for what felt like the first time in years. "I didn't think you'd fight this hard," she said. Her voice was quiet, no performance in it. I met her eyes. "Then you never really knew me," I replied. She left. The door closed behind her. Neil stood up and put a hand briefly on my shoulder without saying anything. Dorothy packed her files with the brisk satisfaction of a woman who'd done exactly what she'd been hired to do. Grant shook my hand and told me his office would handle the paperwork. I walked out into a sharp May afternoon, stood on the sidewalk for a moment, and breathed. On the drive home, Neil finally spoke. "You good?" "Getting there," I said honestly. Cooper was in the yard when I pulled up, sitting in the dirt near the fence, doing something deliberate and focused with a collection of rocks and sticks. He looked up when he heard my truck and stood, brushing his hands on his jeans with that serious little face of his. I got out and crouched down to his level. "Hey, bud." "Hey, Daddy." He held up a rock. "I made a barn." I looked at the arrangement of sticks and stones in the dirt. It did look something like a barn, if you used generous imagination. "That's a good barn," I told him. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his construction. I sat on the porch steps and watched my son build things out of whatever the ground offered him. The same land his great-grandfather had first broken, the same sky overhead, the same light at the end of the day. Whatever Bridget had thought she was taking from me, she never touched the part that mattered most. The $31,000 came back in 3 installments. The first, $28,000, cleared within a week of the settlement signing, drawn directly from the frozen Indianapolis account. The remaining $3,000 came through a court-monitored payment arrangement tied to the sale of Bridget's car. She bought a used Honda with what was left. I didn't ask, and I didn't care. The money went back into the farm's operating account where it belonged, and Dorothy Payne filed a closing report that Grant kept on record. William Holloway's situation unwound separately and without any involvement from me. Tara's attorney had filed a parallel divorce proceeding in Indianapolis, and the documentation she'd assembled, combined with what Russell had gathered, left Holloway very little room to negotiate. His company, once they became aware of the personal expenses he'd been running through his company card, quietly terminated his employment. He lost his salary, his territory, and his professional standing inside of 6 weeks. Tara kept the house and primary custody of their children. The last I heard through Grant, Holloway had relocated to another state. Bridget moved into a rental in Millhaven. She completed the first phase of her court-required counseling program, and her supervised visitation with Cooper began on schedule, 2 afternoons a week at a neutral location, with a coordinator present. Cooper handled it the way 4-year-olds handle most things, by adapting faster than the adults around him expected. He never asked about the red toy truck again. At some point it disappeared from the kitchen table, and I didn't go looking for it. Neil drove out every other weekend for the first 2 months. We worked the fields together on Saturday mornings, ate lunch on the porch, argued about football with the comfortable ease of brothers who'd found their way back to each other through something hard. He'd been right about everything, and he didn't once remind me of it, which is the mark of a man worth keeping close. Otis remained what he'd always been, the best neighbor a man could ask for and the least interested in recognition for it. I bought him a new tackle box in June, a good one, with organized trays and a solid latch. Left it on his porch without a note. He never mentioned it. Neither did I. We both knew what it was for. Dorothy Payne sent a handwritten card after the case closed. 3 sentences. The last one read, "Your son is fortunate to have a father who keeps his accounts honest." I pinned it to the corkboard in the farm office, next to the planning schedule and the equipment maintenance log, where I'd see it every day. The summer came in hot and dry, the way Indiana summers do. I was up before dawn most mornings, out in the fields while the air was still cool, checking soil, adjusting irrigation, doing the 10,000 small things that keep a farm alive. Cooper would sometimes be awake when I came back in for breakfast, sitting at the table in his pajamas, waiting. One morning in late July, he looked up from his cereal and said, "Daddy, are we staying here forever?" I sat down across from him. "You planning on going somewhere?" He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything. "No," he decided. I like it here. Me too, but I told him. Me too. That was the whole conversation. It was enough. 9 months after the settlement, I planted the south field in wheat for the first time in 4 years. It was a rotation decision, practical and overdue, but it felt like something more than that on the morning I ran the first pass with the seeder. There's something about putting seed in ground you fought to keep that lands differently than just farming. Every row felt deliberate. Every acre felt earned twice. Neil was there for that first day. He's not a farmer. Never has been. But he drove down from Lafayette and rode the tractor with me for one pass across the field, sitting on the fender the way we used to do as kids when our father ran the equipment. He didn't say much. The land didn't need commentary. Cooper had started at a small preschool in Millhaven that fall. 3 mornings a week. His teacher sent home a drawing in the first month, a house with a barn beside it, a figure labeled Dad in careful block letters, a smaller figure labeled me. Stick arms, crayon colors, the whole standard repertoire. I put it on the refrigerator, and it stayed there. His relationship with Bridget settled into something functional and civil, the way those things do when the adults involved decide that the child's stability matters more than their own residual grievances. Bridget completed her counseling program. Her visits became unsupervised in the fall. Cooper seemed fine. Kids are remarkably resilient when the adults around them stop using them as leverage. Jenna Marsh from the flower shop stopped me in the hardware store one afternoon in September. She looked like she'd been rehearsing something. "Clayton," she started, "I want you to know that I'm sorry for—" "Jenna," I said, not unkindly, "we're square." I picked up the box of screws I needed and moved on. Some things don't require a long conversation. Forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting, and it isn't the same as pretending. It's just deciding that carrying something no longer serves you. I came across the red toy truck in November at the back of a drawer in the mudroom. I stood there holding it for a moment, small, metal wheels, no brand mark on the bottom, and then I put it in the donation box I keep by the back door. Somebody's kid somewhere would play with it just fine. The holidays came around the way they always do, with their particular weight of comparison to what came before. I kept them simple. Neil brought his girlfriend down for Thanksgiving, a quiet woman named Patrice who asked good questions and helped with the dishes without being asked. Otis came for dinner and brought a pie that was better than anything I could have made. Cooper ate 3 slices and fell asleep on the couch before 7. I sat on the porch after dinner with the last of my coffee and listened to the sounds of the farm settling into the cold. The fields were quiet under a hard sky. The barn light was on, amber and steady. 700 acres. 3 generations deep. One 4-year-old asleep on my couch. One brother driving back to Lafayette in the dark. One neighbor's porch light glowing across the fence line. I didn't need anything more than what was right in front of me. Some men build their lives on what they can acquire. I'd always built mine on what I could keep. Land, loyalty, work, the kind of integrity you can look at in a mirror every morning without flinching. Bridget had underestimated all of it. She'd read my steadiness as passivity, my patience as weakness, my trust as blindness. She'd been wrong on every count. The coffee went cold. I went inside, checked on Cooper, tucked him in properly on the couch with his dinosaur blanket, and turned off the lights. Tomorrow, the fields would need attention. They always do. That's the thing about land. It doesn't care what happened to you. It just needs you to show up and do the work. I've always been good at showing up.